Dear students, now we have to learn ureters and suprarenal glands. Parts of the urinary system are kidneys with renal calyx and renal pelvis, ureters, a urinary bladder, and a ureter. Proximal parts of urinary outflow conduits, minor and major calyces and renal pelvis, are situated within the renal sinus. The apical projection of pyramids, renal papilla, is surrounded by a minor calyx. The minor calyx is a trumpet-shaped structure which surrounds 1 to 3 of renal papilla. In the renal sinus, several minor calyces unite to form a major calyx, and 2 or 3 major calyces unite to form the renal pelvis, which is the funnel-shaped superior end of the ureters. The renal calyx usually fuse with each other to form a single funnel-shaped renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is directed inferolaterally and passes through the renal hilum. The hilum divides the pelvis into intrarenal and extrarenal parts. The anterior surface of the renal pelvis is covered with renal blood vessels, and its posterior surface is free. The renal pelvis is continued with the ureter. I hope that you will recognize in this X-ray image minor renal calyx. 2 or 3 minor renal calyces fuse and form the major renal calyx. 2 or 3 major renal calyces fuse and form the renal pelvis, and renal pelvis continues with ureter. The ureters are muscular tubes about 25 to 30 cm long, whose peristaltic contraction convey urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. Because it's too long, he consists of abdominal part, pelvic part, and intramural part. The upper half of the ureter lies on the posterior abdominal wall, and rest is within the pelvic cavity. The ureter begins as a downward continuation of renal pelvis at the medial margin of the lower end of the kidney. The ureter passes downward and slightly medially on the psoas major muscle, which separates it from the transverse process of the lumbar vertebrae, and enters the pelvic cavity by crossing in front of the bifurcation of the common iliac artery. In the pelvis, the ureter first runs downward, backward, and laterally along the anterior margin of the greater sciatic notch. It turns forward and medially to reach the base of the urinary bladder, where it enters the bladder wall obliquely. Within the bladder wall, it opens into the cavity of the bladder at the lateral angle of its trigone as ureteric orifice. During its course from the kidneys to the urinary bladder, it runs behind the parietal peritoneum. Right and left ureters lies in front of psoas major muscle and genitofemoral nerve, and lies lateral and posterior from the testicular or ovarian artery and vein. On the left image, an intravenous urogram showing a classical retrocaval ureter. On the right image, a degree of obstruction has resulted in a markedly dilated upper right ureter. The suprarenal glands are 2 small bodies, flattened anteroposteriorly and situated one on each side of the median plane behind the peritoneum and immediately anteroposterior to the superior pole of each kidney. The right gland is pyramidal and the left is semilunar and is larger than the right. On each gland we can describe anterior, posterior, and renal surfaces, and superior and medial borders. On the anterior surface we have suprarenal hilum. The suprarenal glands are separated from the kidneys by a thin septum, which is the part of the renal fascia. Each suprarenal gland has 2 parts, an outer suprarenal cortex and inner suprarenal medulla. These parts have different embryological origins and different functions. The suprarenal cortex shows 3 cellular zones. the glomerular zone, the fascicular zone, and the reticular zone, which produce different hormones. The glomerular zone produces aldosterone, the fascicular zone produces cortisol, the reticular zone produces androgens. The suprarenal medulla produces adrenaline. The suprarenal gland is supplied by three groups of the arteries: the superior, middle, and inferior suprarenal arteries, from the inferior phrenic artery, abdominal aorta, and renal artery. You can see here the left suprarenal gland. The green color represents position of superior suprarenal artery, the pink color is the middle suprarenal artery, and the yellow color represents position of inferior suprarenal artery. Please remember that the right suprarenal vein joins the inferior vena cava. It is the direct tributary of the inferior vena cava, and the left suprarenal vein joins the left renal vein, and the left renal vein is the tributary of the inferior vena cava. Each suprarenal gland is supplied by the suprarenal plexus of nerves, which reach the suprarenal gland along the suprarenal arteries. The suprarenal plexus consists of both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. The sympathetic fibers is derived from greater and lesser splanchnic nerves. Preganglionic fibers from the thoracic splanchnic nerves, especially the greater splanchnic nerve, pass across the celiac plexus to end by synapsing with cells in the suprarenal medulla. The preganglionic sympathetic fibers are distributed mainly to the chromaffin cells of the medulla. The activity of the cortex is largely controlled by adrenocorticotropic hormones secreted by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The parasympathetic fibers are derived from both vagus nerves. Dear students, if you have questions, please send me email.